Breaking the Code with Gabriella tells the story of a young girl who overcomes gender stereotypes in robotics, cementing herself as a role model for young women. The book includes science and engineering information such as the design process and Java tutorials. As part of our initiative to empower young girls to pursue their interests in STEM, we're running the Breaking the Code with Gabriella Trailblazers in STEM speaker series, which explores the careers of women in science, technology, engineering, and math. The series aims to dispel gender stereotypes and aid young students in getting advice on how to pursue their own passions. Today, I'm here with Shivani Srikanth, who is a rising junior at Harvard studying the intersection of bioengineering, public policy, and environmental science. She has experience in both sustainable material fabrication and design research, as well as qualitative sociological research, and she was also a recipient of the Coca-Cola Scholarship in 2022. She was also a board member of the Harvard Engineering Society and is currently the co-president of the Harvard Undergraduate Clean Energy Group, where she's involved in multiple projects focused around the clean energy sector. So now I'm going to let Shivani tell me a little bit more about herself. So anything about your journey in STEM, your future goals, or your current interests that you think are notable.
Yeah, totally. Hi, I'm really excited to be here to chat with you. My name is Shivi, as you mentioned, Shivani, and I'm a rising junior at Harvard, as you also mentioned. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in a really tiny town in Massachusetts, right outside of Boston, called North Reading. And I'd say it's something that underscores everything I do, whether it's like professionally or within school, is I'm really passionate about trying to solve sociological and societal issues in strategic and creative ways. I can talk a little bit about like my background as well. My experience, I guess, in like academics, extracurriculars, however you're thinking about things, has really been like two-pronged. My area of study is bioengineering, as you mentioned. And I do explore that through a lens of health, environment, even sort of thinking about things like racial and social justice through the lens of technology. I'm also deeply passionate about things like social justice, youth activism, and organizing. Again, primarily with regards to things like racial and climate justice. And then to sort of think a little broader, I really love research. I love academia. I'm hoping to get my PhD at some point, probably post grad, and maybe after working, traveling a little bit. And then other interests, hobbies. I'm pretty outdoorsy. I love to hike. I love swimming. And I am involved in a lot of projects, initiatives, both big and small, both on and off campus, which I also consider my hobbies. So just a little bit about me.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. Before we move on to the next question, I would love to hear a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, totally. So I have really long been interested in sort of the intersection of tech and society. And it's a little bit of a cliche, I know. It's kind of on a lot of people's minds these days, particularly with things like AI and ChatGPT and stuff like that. My personal focus currently in college is thinking about things like health and climate justice and how they can be tackled through strategic, sensitive design and research. I can talk a little bit more about what I did in high school and stuff like that later on. But for the most part, I have always sort of thought about things like engineering and technology from a background of like social change.
All right. Okay, so on your LinkedIn, you state that your passions lie in using bioengineering as a tool for developing solutions for climate change and human health challenges. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how you're working towards this goal or how you're aiming to do this in the future?
Yeah, of course. I can talk a little bit about like both past, present,
Mhm.
future stuff. But in high school, I did a lot of work with a field called compassionate design, which sort of inspired a lot of where I think about tech and engineering now. And compassionate design is this idea where people design products and programs that center things like user dignity, rights, justice, some things that are really important when you're designing things, but not something that's very present in fields like engineering, just because they're so technical and often really, really corporate and really seen from that lens. And so I sort of injected this principle of compassionate design into everything I did in high school, and I try to continue to do that now. And an example, I guess, is I taught a few engineering courses in high school to girls of color in Lynn, Massachusetts, through this nonprofit. And in designing that curriculum, something that I was super aware of was making sure engineering was very accessible and representative, and that it was rooted in things like diverse perspectives and the goal of solving social issues. And now in college, I think about compassionate design, but I'm also thinking about things like climate change, which you briefly said, from that technical lens. And an example of that is earlier this year, I was doing research in a lab on butterfly wings and the reflective properties they have. So something that's really cool is that there's this sort of new sort of like branch, I guess, of bioengineering that focuses on solutions that are rooted in nature and animals and things like that. And a cool fact about butterfly wings is that they have structures in their wings that can promote something called radiative cooling, which can cool the insect like internally. And so the research we were looking at was interested in mitigating things like climate change and extreme heat by mimicking this technology that the insect has. So to kind of go back to what you asked and more specifically answer your question, I really do believe that technology can bring positive change when rooted in things like nature or justice or sort of thinking about community perspectives and what like the needs are of populations and really trying to inject that into things like designs and solutions.
All right, well, thank you so much. That's so interesting. Okay, so for the next question, receiving the Coca-Cola scholarship is very impressive, and congratulations. So, how would you say this scholarship helped you on your educational path, and do you have any advice for students who might want to apply for it?
Totally. Yeah, no, the Coca-Cola Scholars Foundation has been a really, really massive supporter of all of my interests, both throughout the end of high school and now in college. It's been a really wonderful community to be a part of, and I'd say that's probably the biggest draw, as well as the biggest impact on my educational journey. There's just so many scholars, both in Harvard and in other institutions around the country, that I've just been able to connect with and have like really, really great conversations with. It also has such a cool like alumni like pipeline. You can meet so many really cool people and really amazing like parts of their career who've been Coca-Cola scholars in the past. And it's just a really, really amazing way to kind of get like mentors built in. I was sort of in like this mentorship program with the Scholarship Foundation last year with a alum. And me and him sort of had this really, really cool, like back and forth every few weeks, and we would just sit down, we would chat, we would debrief, we talk about our lives, and he just gave some amazing advice. And so ultimately, it's been a really, really cool part of my academic career because it really does sort of help build up some of those skills that people don't really think they need. But they're like things that you really do need, regardless of whether you're going to tech or whether you're going into public speaking, whatever it is, like you do need like skills like public speaking and socializing and being able to hold conversations and connect with people and network. And Coca-Cola is like this scholarship foundation is just like been a big help in that for me. But again, I'll go back and say that the community is like the biggest sort of piece of that. And I'd say for people who are in high school who are interested in applying, I'd say make sure you really stick to your passions and what you're interested in. And this goes for things like college applications too. People think you need to have like a fancy application or really good scores, but it really does just boil down to having your passions and what you're interested in shining through in a really unique way. And whatever that looks like is unique to you. So there's no like one size fits all, but if you really love what you're doing, it almost always like comes through. And again, that's like a little bit cliche, but it's also like very, very true, I feel like. I feel like a lot of things that are cliche when it comes to things like college applications or scholarship applications have a lot of truth to them as well. So, just a little tidbit of advice, but I would definitely encourage people to apply. It's like a really, really great program.
All right, well, thank you for the insight. So, as I mentioned previously, you were previously a board member of the Harvard Engineering Society. So, could you tell us about your goals with the organization and how you were working towards them?
Truly, yeah. I actually just finished up my term with them as a board member. In my freshman year of college, I was a freshman representative to the board, and I worked sort of on like equity and things like that within the engineering department. at Harvard.
Mhm.
That was a really, really cool experience. And then in my sophomore year, which just ended, I was a board member for the society, and I was one of the chairs of the mentorship committee.
Mhm.
And so that really focused on trying to bring together like a really diverse group of engineers into spaces where they could learn more about like careers, but also just build connections with each other. And it was a really, really rewarding experience. I think the engineering society at Harvard is really unique because engineering is a pretty small major. So it makes the whole community really, really tight knit. Ultimately, the society is something that every engineer is a part of by just being engineers.
Mhm.
So I'm really lucky to still be a part of it, even though my board member term is up. But it was a really amazing experience.
So, just related to that, you mentioned how it kind of has a focus on diversity. Can you talk more about like how the mentorship relates to diversity and how it works to kind of unite the engineers?
Yeah, totally. I'd say something that's really, I guess, amazing about Harvard's engineering program is that because it's relatively new and it is sort of rooted in things like liberal arts education, it does have a pretty cool group of students involved. And it means that like people who are interested in things like equity and justice, as well as people who are interested in things like pure math and pure CS all come together and think about things like engineering and math from those angles. And it means that a lot of people with a lot of diverse perspectives are all sort of in one room. So when I was chairing the mentorship committee, something that was important to me was making sure that everybody sort of found their niche within engineering at Harvard, regardless of their backgrounds, but also making sure that things like identity and experience were really respected and sort of honored in that way. Engineering is a super male dominated field with really small sort of, I guess, minority presence, very few sort of people of color in high like ranking positions in academia, places like that. So generally across the board, it's been important to us to try and create a strong mentorship pipeline so that people who are underrepresented in fields can really find their footing and find their ground and feel supported going through a really rigorous and difficult program.
I love that. So you're also the co-president of the Harvard Undergraduate Clean Energy Group. So what inspires you to get involved with this organization, and what are some of the projects that you're working on?
Yeah, of course. I'd say my interest in climate really sort of drove my involvement in this. I started out my very like first sort of I guess, experience with this club was my freshman fall, where I applied to be a market analyst on one of their consulting projects. And it's a pretty big club. It's around 250 members. It's the largest climate organization on Harvard's campus. And they run like a lot of projects and a lot of sort of areas of focus, but all ultimately rooted in clean energy, and sort of like clean energy solutions. So in my freshman fall, I applied to be a market analyst for a graphite company, and sort of just did like market research and presented to the CEO. And I found that to be a really fulfilling and cool experience. I think another field that is pretty underrepresented with people of color and women is sort of like market research, economics, sort of like that big sort of finance field. And so I hadn't really dipped my foot in it, and having that experience really gave me a lot of confidence in thinking about things like finance and econ. But ultimately, I ended up sort of pivoting and applying to be a board member for that club. And a lot of my application for the board position was rooted in equity and was rooted in racial justice, because that was sort of like my root passion. And so I wrote a lot about wanting to bring a really equitable space within this organization and wanting to make like things like clean tech and clean energy a field that is really focused on bringing equitable change and equitable transitions away from things like coal. Ultimately, clean energy is sort of this field where you're trying to implement things like solar panels and windmills to create this transition away from coal and other really harmful energy sort of sources. both harmful for human health and to the environment. And so I was really passionate about trying to find an equitable way to do that so that people in all sort of populations, communities, developing nations, et cetera, had equal access to these sort of innovations. And so I wrote about that in my application for the board position. And so they ended up creating a new board position that was rooted around energy equity because they hadn't really had that focus in the past. And so I was able to serve out my term as a board member, and I was working on like an equity project that looked at the intersection of affordable housing and clean energy, and that was a really rewarding process. And then last last winter, last fall-ish, came time to elect a new co-president for this organization, and I ran with one of my really close friends. And once we were elected, we ended up presiding over a pretty large board. It's around 15 people, 15 board members, and then a really large organization. Ultimately, I mentioned it's 200 members. So it's been a really, really amazing experience. I think something that especially women, but like women of any background, of any sort of economic background, any racial background should have or try to have experience in leadership. I'd say, especially in college, having this sort of leadership experience has been really, really life-changing. It's been amazing to sort of be able to make really important decisions that have some sort of stakes, but do it in a really safe environment, which is ultimately college. And ultimately, I think this has been probably the most rewarding experience of my like last few years in college.
That's amazing, and congratulations on the election and the position. Just related to that, I wanted to ask, do you think the creation of the new equity related position on the board kind of shifted the focus of the organization a little bit? And, like, if so, how?
That's a really good question. I think something that's cool about a lot of students who are passionate about climate is that there is sometimes a equal passion for things like justice and society. But I think a problem is it's not always the main focus. And I'm of the belief that justice, whether it's racial justice, gender justice, needs to be at the forefront of a lot of fields, if not all of them. And so this was something that was important to me because the clean energy transition, just to give some background for people who might not know, the clean energy transition is generally something that is set up to be not very equitable. Only people who have access to higher incomes will probably be able to afford more expensive changes like solar panels or affordable sort of heating systems and things like that because they're not subsidized or like the costs aren't lowered by the government. And so thinking about things like that, like how can people in the US who may not live in like really rich communities, how can they access these like really key pieces of technology? Like not being exposed to things like coal or oil should be a human right. You should be allowed to breathe like fresh air and you should be not exposed to hard chemicals. And ultimately, it should be a human right to live on a safe planet. So a lot of things like climate technology and clean energy are rooted in human rights and human justice. And to me, that was something that I wanted this organization to have more of a focus on. So being able to run this equity project alongside this group of like really dedicated people was just a really amazing experience. We ended up working with Mass Housing, which is a local housing agency, and we did some research for them about how green banking works. And so we're getting into really technical stuff here, so feel free to pull me out of it.
Okay.
Uh, Ultimately, that was our focus, and it was a really exciting sort of project and a really cool way to sort of introduce things like equity and justice to a club that was already doing really amazing things.
I love that. That's so amazing. So, throughout your journey, what challenges have you faced as a woman in a male dominated field, and how have you overcome them?
Yeah, totally. I think that's probably what the crux of this is. Whether it's clean energy, whether it's bioengineering, whether it's even just like leadership in general, a lot of those fields are male dominated. And I think what's the most difficult about that as like a younger woman is just not being able to see yourself in a lot of these places. Whether it's like in professors or just researchers, or if I go to a talk and it's like the audience is mostly male or the speaker is male, it's something that's really like viscerally prominent to me. Like I'm very hyper aware of the fact that I'm like the only woman in a room. Mostly because of the fact that you do feel like you're not as listened to for your ideas, or you maybe feel like you're not as appreciated for your ideas. And ultimately, a lot of these things can be sort of put down. Like people could say, oh, like that's not that big of a deal. Like feeling appreciated for your ideas, like what is that? That's not even like a real problem. But the thing is, with like women who are in spaces that they're constantly feeling sort of I guess, pushed down by their coworkers or superiors, or they just don't feel as though they're in a space where they're being appreciated, that can be a really like big burden for somebody to carry over time. Like those microaggressions can really build up. And so I think for me, something that's been really important is trying to surround myself with the women that I find in my field, and particularly finding like really close like sisterhoods with those people. I think the big thing for like women or girls trying to navigate or enter a male-dominated field is to really try, and this is going to be hard to do, it's easier to say, but really try not to let like little things affect you at all. Because at the end of the day, a lot of that will build up and a lot of it will end up hurting you. So trying to make sure that you can stand above that and keep your head above it is sort of like the tip to make sure that you can sort of stay afloat in your field.
Thank you. Honestly, like I love that advice because I feel like so when I've talked have when I've had all these interviews, so many people have been like, "Oh, like be assertive," and that's super important. But the idea of sisterhood and kind of having the confidence to get past the little things is a really great concept. And thank you for sharing.
Yes.
So yeah, if there was any piece of career related advice you could give to your middle school self, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it kind of has to do with what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
honestly. I'd say like number one, push yourself out of your comfort zone. I think that's like a big thing. I feel like a lot of women in general feel really trapped in their environments, which is fair. Like a lot of environments are like trapping. But I think the big thing is that you really should try and push yourself out of your comfort zone, even if it means putting yourself in uncomfortable situations. I think the big thing though is don't stand for like injustice. I think that's a big thing. Well, when I said like don't let small things hurt you, that's very much so like a personal thing. Like make sure you're keeping yourself positive, make sure you're keeping your head above the water, but don't let injustice sort of just happen. Definitely stand up for yourself. Definitely be assertive, as you said. I know it's a common answer,
Mm-hmm.
but do it. But again, I think sisterhood is the big thing. I think finding people you can talk to whether you're a woman or not, I mean, just generally, like as career advice, like finding people you can talk to is a big sort of piece. Like being able to vent about things, whether it's in school or the workplace, like that's necessary. And having close friends, family, somebody you can let steam off to, like that's really critical.
All right. Building off the previous question, what advice would you give to young girls who are looking to get involved with engineering?
Totally. I'd say as a first sort of not like caveat, but like as a preface for anybody interested in engineering, think about why you're interested in engineering. Um, Fields like engineering or computer science often are focused on things like profit or like making it up the corporate ladder or making a lot of money, which is important, especially for women, especially with things like the wage gap. Like being able to sustain yourself financially is important. But another thing is making sure you don't lose your values and your morals and your ethics is really important. And sometimes these fields can be cutthroat and they can be really hard. So thinking about why you're interested in it and thinking about what is it that I'm doing engineering for? And for me, it was thinking about strategic ways to solve social issues and really bridging gaps with design and products. Like that was my passion. So making sure you stay centered in that is really important. For women specifically, I will say that engineering is hard and it does not get easier based on the fact that you are really surrounded by men in really like high positions of power. Sometimes they don't listen to you. Sometimes they'll discredit you. Sometimes your inventions or your work will go sort of unnoticed. I'd say the big thing is try and get credit for everything you do. Specifically in engineering, in research and things like that, credit is a big thing. And things like papers or getting your name on things that you worked really hard on, sometimes that's just not as like easy for women to do. And so making sure you get credit for your hard work is a big thing that I would suggest you put your sort of like focus on because it's not necessarily fair if you put a lot of work into it and somebody else is really getting like the accolades or the applause for it. I'd also say, again, finding the people in your field who are on your side and finding the people in your field who are other women, I think is a big thing. A lot of my close friends at Harvard are women who are engineers, and it's sometimes just a really, really great feeling to be able to talk to them about the field, whether it's technical or whether it's venting about like a really annoying moment with a guy in the field or something. Like just being able to have that conversation with another woman who really gets you, that's a big thing. So I'd say building out that sisterhood that we've mentioned, really centering yourself in why you're doing engineering and making sure you don't lose sort of like your like inner focus. And then three, making sure you get credit for your hard work. That's a big thing that I feel like people don't mention, but a lot of women lose out on it.
Well, thank you so much for the insight and for talking with me today.